Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey. Today, we're going to try and get set up for Game Week 17. So as always, let's start off with a quick summary of how the previous game week went. Game week 16 was a very weird one, and only 2 players in my starting 11 actually returned. Obviously, Haaland getting himself injured, didn't play in the Luton game, meant that my captaincy went across to Mo Salah. Now, obviously, that went very well, so got a bit fortunate there. Arch came off my bench for 2 points, and Son being the only other player to return in my starting 11. Normally, that would mean a big red arrow, but because of the sheer amount of points that Son was able to pick up in those 90 minutes against Newcastle, 17 points is a huge haul. I won't be forgetting that in a hurry, but that was in itself able to give me a pretty big green arrow in a week where not many popular picks returned at all. So if you're also looking at a team with only 1 or 2 returns in there, don't worry, there wasn't really much to pick apart between you and teams that got a big green arrow this week. It was mainly just down to 1 or 2 players. And obviously, if 1 or 2 players can do it this week, then another 1 or 2 players, perhaps in your team, can do it next week. So fingers crossed, if you had a bit of bad fortune in game week 16, then hopefully it reverses in game week 17 and beyond. But for me personally, it was a big green arrow up to 274k from, I think it was 375. So 100k green. Hopefully we can back that up in game week 17. So let's get prepared for that now. So the big question for this game week is obviously whether or not we should be selling Erling Haaland if you've got him in your team already. So obviously missed the Luton game. We're unsure as it stands as to whether or not he's going to be playing in game week 17. Although earlier this week, Pep did say that he thinks it's fairly unlikely he will. However, in the most recent press conference we've got, Pep did come out and say, I cannot answer. The next press conference, maybe I can be more precise. So fingers crossed that later today, or I think it's on Thursday, but it could be on Friday, we'll get some sort of precise answer from Pep as to whether or not he's going to be fit. But I think based on his track record and the fact that he's really got no obligation to give us anything specific, it's going to be quite likely that he's, again, a little bit up in the air. He won't give us an exact answer, and he'll probably say it's touch and go. So there are 3 avenues I think this could go down. Avenue 1 is he does give a precise answer and he says he's going to be fit for Crystal Palace. I think that's going to be quite an unlikely scenario. But if that's the case, I think he's a definite hold. I just wanted to add the XGI per 90 on this screen and the next upcoming fixtures just to give us an example of how good he's going to be over the next run. Yes, he's got the blank in game week 18, but I think if he's only going to miss that 1 game, then game week 17 is great. Game week 19 and 20 are both great. So I think if you can avoid selling him, I would. So if he gives a precise answer that he is going to be fit, or if we get a leak early on Friday that he's going to be ready for the Crystal Palace match, then I think you hold. Scenario 2 is that he gives a precise answer and he's not going to be fit. He's definitely out, or we get a team leak that says he's not going to be playing the Palace match. Now, in that scenario, I would be very tempted to sell. And in my team, I would probably be selling him. The reason I would do that is because obviously game week 17 and 18, he'd both be blanking in, not playing in 18. And then he will be going off to the Club World Cup as well during that game week 18 period. So we'll get a good sense of whether or not he's going to be fit for game week 19 around about then when he's off at the Club World Cup. Now, it could easily be, if he's not ready for Crystal Palace, that Everton isn't even that far away. It's within 2 weeks from now. So I would say that if he's a doubt for this one and he's not going to be risked for Crystal Palace, then there's still a chance that he wouldn't even be ready for game week 19. So I think even with a 2-game week break for him, I think he's worth selling because there are other strikers you can get to and there's not much value tied up in him. In fact, there's no value because he's back to his starting price of 14 million. Now, that is very expensive. in that scenario where you do sell him, I'd probably advocate for keeping that money spare personally and not spreading it around. And then you can get back to him in one move later down the line if you have to. I'll show you later on what I'm planning on doing with him in that scenario. But let's move on to probably the more realistic scenario that Pep doesn't give us anything precise. And let's say, for argument's sake, we don't get a team leak. Now, in that scenario, we don't really know whether he's going to be playing Crystal Palace. So I think we probably need to analyse the clues that we've gotten so far. Now, the information we've gotten up to this point is that we haven't seen him in training. He's got some sort of stress reaction on a muscle in his foot. Pretty important for a footballer, let's say. And Haaland is a player that historically has needed little breaks and little rests, especially when he was at Dortmund, to make sure that he was going to be ready for the run-in. Now, City are a team who have got an elite World Cup winning striker in their starting 11 usually, that could easily move into Haaland's spot. And I think, given the difficulty of the Palace fixture, I think if there is a chance that he's not going to be fit enough for it, Pep probably isn't going to risk it, knowing that he could aggravate that issue. So I think unless we get something precise, I'm going to treat it as it's unlikely he's going to play personally, which leads me down the scenario where I risk selling him for a couple of game weeks against Crystal Palace and then the blank, and then probably have one free transfer. I can easily do it in one move to sell a player and bring him back in without needing a hit in game week 19 or 20, depending whether or not we get news on his fitness around then. So in summary, anything precise, I think we follow the narrative there. If he's a yes for Palace, you hold him. If he's a no for Palace, then you get rid for a couple of weeks, keeping that money in the bank. And then if we don't get anything precise, which I think is the likely scenario here, then personally for me, I would probably go without him for a couple of weeks, knowing that I've got an easy route back to him. But that is a risky manoeuvre. Obviously, he could still play Palace in that scenario. And if he does, that's a great fixture for him. So he could easily haul. But I think because we've got Mo Salah at home to Man United, that's another really good captainable fixture. I think you could go without him for this game week and still come off okay, especially when you consider the other strikers like Ollie Watkins, like Dominic Solanke, both have good fixtures as well. So bringing in one of them isn't the worst thing in the world. And who knows, even if Haaland plays, they could potentially match him in one game week alone. So it's a difficult one, but wait for the team news, wait for team leaks as well, potentially on Friday, and see if we can get anything precise. But if not, personally, I think I might be selling him. So Matty Cash has stayed in my team for way too long now, and this is probably one that is a little bit more personal to me than most other managers, because I think a lot of you have probably gotten rid already. However, with injuries week in, week out for my side, he's sort of just been nestled on my bench in recent weeks, and I haven't really been able to get rid of him. I'm hoping yet again that I can make this transfer this week, and even for a -4 hit, I'm pretty likely to do it at this point. Getting rid of Matty Cash, bringing in Pedro Porro, who's got great fixtures, increasingly good underlying data, and the fact that he's actually playing at the moment, especially in a team that are performing really well. He is getting forward a lot. He's been unlucky not to get a big haul recently as well, especially in that Newcastle game. I think it is a pretty simple transfer, and I want to get it done before the price difference between these two is just too extreme to make it worthwhile. So Pedro Porro is going to be hopefully a priority transfer in for me this week. If there are significant other injuries in my side and that it needs to be managed and I need to take a -8 or a -12 to get to Pedro Porro, then maybe it has to wait yet another week. But I think, considering the defensive issues I've got elsewhere, and the fact that he would come into my starting 11 this week and be one of the more important players away at Nottingham Forest, I am pretty likely to be doing this move this week. So hopefully I'm finally cashing out. But if there are other injuries that crop up from the Europa League, from the midweek Champions League press conferences, the post-match press conferences, then possibly it has to wait one more week. But I really hope that I can make this move and get it done and get Matty Cash out of my side, because it doesn't look like he's a secure starter at any point soon. So speaking of midweek injuries, Anthony Gordon did go off last night on around the 60th minute against AC Milan with what looked like a tight hamstring. Now, Eddie Howe, after the match, did come out and provided us with a pretty decent quote, actually. So Gordon said that he had an awareness of his hamstring. Not really sure exactly what that means. I'm assuming it means a tightness in the hamstring. But he says, I'm not really sure if it's an injury because he could still have played on, but he couldn't have played to the level that he has played for a long time. So reading between the lines from Eddie there, which is pretty hard to do, may I add, I would say that it wasn't necessarily a flat-out injury, but he wasn't moving freely. He had a little bit of a concern, and he has played a lot of minutes recently. So maybe it was just a matter of managing the minutes and getting himself off the pitch before something fairly minor was aggravated. And I've played through a hamstring injury before, obviously to a much lower level, and you can kind of feel it when it is a little bit tight. I don't know about you, but you get that feeling that something's coming, and if you are able to take yourself out of the firing line in time, that overnight or over a couple of days can hopefully reduce, and then it's okay to play again in a few days' time. Now, obviously, that's just my personal experience from a much lower level, and I'm not trying to compare myself to Anthony Gordon. However, I'm hoping that if he's registered that early enough, if he's noticed it quickly enough, then fingers crossed he's still going to be okay for Fulham in game week 17. Now, it is a doubt, and I wouldn't be surprised if I saw him on the bench against Fulham because it could be an injury, it could be something more major, and he has also played a lot of minutes, and Newcastle have got players coming back in. So Isak came off the bench for him and played that left wing role. That could easily be the case on Saturday against Fulham. Or, of course, Joe Linton could also go there as well. So he's definitely not a nailed starter for this weekend. However, with other issues in my side and the fact that I've got Cameron Archer on my bench, who now at Sheffield United looks like a player who could here and there pick up some points, I think I'm probably going to risk just sticking with Gordon for this week. Even if he misses game week 17, then I'm happy enough with relying on Archer for one game week and then Gordon coming back in game week 18 is fine. Now, the underlying data is still strong. One thing I would note on Gordon is that his minutes probably will be managed a bit more often moving forwards. I think we've gotten used to him playing 80 plus to 90 minutes every single week recently. I think with Barnes coming back in, with Isak coming back in, and Wilson being fit, more importantly, it gives them options and they don't necessarily need to be giving him flat out 90 minutes every single week anymore. So I think he will get slightly reduced minutes and he could be a sell in the next few game weeks. However, because of injuries elsewhere, because of suspensions this week, I think he's probably a player I'm just going to hold on to, get a bit more information on, and if I need to rely on my bench for him, then I will do for this week only. So here is my starting 11 for game week 17 without any transfers made. And as you can see, Lascelles at the moment is starting at home to Fulham in the back three. Tsimikas and Saliba also there. Now, none of those three I'm really expecting a clean sheet from, and possibly the one that on paper at the start of the season would have looked the hardest, i.e. Man United at home for Liverpool, for a clean sheet at least, is now probably the one that I'm most convinced in starting. So I'm most convinced of starting Tsimikas in my back three. Lascelles is actually the one that I'm most concerned about. Newcastle, yes, at home have been very, very strong, but they are now conceding quite a few goals. They do look very leggy, and Lascelles in particular might need a rest, and he has looked like a player that's struggling with an injury recently as well, despite starting matches consecutively week in, week out. He could be the one that I might need to bench here. So that would be one issue I need to deal with. Another would be obviously Erling Haaland in my starting two up front at the moment, but he could easily miss out. And that's the reason at the moment I've got my captaincy on Mo Salah, vice captaincy on Son. I think if we get news that Haaland is fit, 100% starting for game week 17, then I could put the armband on him instead. I think that would be a very good fixture for Erling Haaland, but Mo Salah has a great record against Man United. Man United are up on the ropes a bit now, so Maguire went off injured, Shaw went off injured in midweek, so I would expect that to be a really good fixture for Liverpool. And Son, obviously, in the form he's in, away at Nottingham Forest, also not a bad shout either. What I would say is on paper, there are a lot of really good fixtures here. Saka at home to Brighton, Palmer at home to Sheffield United, Gordon at home to Fulham. All of that does spell goals on paper, but because of the tight turnaround for a lot of these teams playing in European competition, because of the injuries in my squad, I do need to make a couple of moves, I think. So let's take a look at that scenario now. So here's that starting 11 with the transfers made. Now, this is in the scenario that Haaland isn't confirmed to start against Palace, so he's either definitely going to be out or we don't get news. And in that scenario, I'd probably look at bringing in Ollie Watkins for Haaland and obviously freeing up a lot of money in the bank. So in doing that, that gives me a really strong front seven. It means that I do hold on to Darwin against Man United, who may or may not start, but if he does, I think that's a fantastic fixture for him. And Ollie Watkins, obviously, I really wanted to get back to ahead of Game Week 18, where he goes up against Sheffield United at home, which is going to be a pretty tempting captaincy option, despite Sheffield United improving so far under the new management. So Ollie Watkins coming in, I think, is a priority for me, alongside Porro, who comes in for Matty Cash. Now, Matty Cash was initially on my bench. Obviously, I've upgraded Porro to the starting 11 and taken Lascelles out of the firing line against Fulham. Now, Fulham historically haven't been the strongest team, but back-to-back games, 5-0 wins. And they do look like a team very much in form, could cause Newcastle a lot of problems. Even though it's at St James's Park, I'd be tempted to say that Fulham do score in that game. And Newcastle will be a little bit tired after their midweek exploits in the Champions League. Lascelles in particular has looked quite leggy in recent weeks too. So I'd be a little bit concerned about him there. Saliba's the other one that I'd be concerned about in the back three there. But I think Arsenal ownership in the defence is going to be very high this week. Quite a few people are doubled up. So I don't feel so exposed to that in comparison to the Newcastle defence, especially because Trippier is suspended for this week. So that's a massive chunk of ownership in the Newcastle defence that won't be problematic to me. So I'm not so scared of Newcastle this week because of the Trippier suspension, which means that I don't really need to battle against it and start Lascelles to try and shield myself against that. So Saliba, I think, despite the fact that Brighton have scored in every league game so far this season, I think Saliba is maybe the player out of those two that would start in that scenario. Now, obviously, there is a scenario where Haaland is confirmed to start against Crystal Palace, in which case I would obviously not be buying Ollie Watkins for Erling Haaland, and I could look at selling Darwin for Watkins instead. Now, in that scenario, I'd actually be really tempted to try not to take a hit in a week where a lot of managers will have to take a hit, and maybe hold off on either buying Porro or Watkins. I think if I'm going on gut instinct at the moment, I'd probably hold off on Ollie Watkins for one game week and maybe bring him in game week 18 instead. However, that is up for debate. I don't want to lock that in, and I think it's a pretty unlikely scenario that we get confirmed news that Haaland is going to start before the Friday deadline. So based on the lack of news, I think that these are going to be my likely moves. Now, obviously, there is a yellow flag on Sanchez as well. We could get a press conference that says that he is going to be out for game week 17. And that would be really annoying considering Sheffield United at home is obviously a pretty good fixture. However, I don't think it's worth another -4 for me. I don't think that there are any keepers out there that I'm so convinced of a clean sheet for that it's going to be worth that -4 hit, because obviously you would need that keeper to keep that clean sheet or get a penalty save in order to pay off -4. Now, obviously, if Sanchez doesn't play, I'm relying on Turner, and recently that wouldn't have been good news. However, he did start in the most recent match, so maybe he starts again against Tottenham at home. Now, obviously not a good fixture, but if he can get any save points in that game, then that would be a bonus. And like I said, I just don't think that there are any keepers that are likely to pay off in 10 scenarios out of 10 that -4 here. And because I'm not convinced of that, and because Sanchez longer term still looks like a pretty okay keeper to have in terms of the fixtures, I'm likely to just leave that be for this week. And then if it turns out to be a much longer term injury, then maybe I can reassess in the next few game weeks. So there you have it. That's my game week 17 team selection. Not quite locked in yet because I am waiting on that Erling Haaland news, as I'm sure a lot of you are. But if you do have any questions ahead of the game week 17 deadline, please do feel free to leave them in the comments below and I'll try and answer them all before we hit the deadline on Friday evening. In the meantime, if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, that would be greatly appreciated, and it means that you won't miss out on any future content. But for now, I wish you all the best in game week 17, and I'll see you on the other side as we start preparing for game week 18 next week.